The stark reality of the dates was like a heavy hammer blow, driving the final nail into the coffin of Lily's old life. She sat at her kitchen table, the two letters spread out, one signed James speaking of his eyes, the other signed J confirming the timing and the desperate, forbidden nature of the affair. Her birth certificate lay between them, the date of birth aligning perfectly with the 9 months following the second, more desperate note. The geometry of the deceit was complete. Lily wasn't just the pastor's daughter. She was the reason for all the swift, panicked marriages and calls to ministry, the unintended consequence that required an entire town to pretend they didn't hear the whispers. And poor George. Oh, George, the true hero of this tragic folktale. She looked at his photograph on the mantel, his quiet, steady gaze, his slightly worn face, and she finally understood the depth of his quiet suffering. He knew. He must have known the truth of her paternity the day he married Sarah, or shortly after, and yet he stayed. He signed that birth certificate, he took her fishing, he taught her how to change a tire, and he loved her with a commitment that transcended blood. He had stood as a shield, protecting Sarah's reputation and giving Lily a life free of scandal, while the biological father was celebrated every Sunday. George had chosen love over ego, chosen kindness over truth, and in doing so, he had become the real man of God in this story. Lily realized her rage was not just at James's lie, but at the casual cruelty of his ambition that forced George into such a silent, lifelong sacrifice. It made her love George all the more fiercely, but it solidified her resolve to expose the man who had stolen her true father's credit and peace. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. The truth, now fully known, was a fever in her blood, and her subconscious, that deep well of inherited memory, started to stir. She dreamed not of George, nor of James in his pulpit, but of the creek, the very place mentioned in the first terrifying letter. In the dream, the Harmony Creek was rushing, the water dark and muddy, and the banks were overgrown with thick, choking kudzu vines, wrapping around everything like a heavy, green secret. And there, standing on the bank, was a younger Reverend James, not the silver-haired saint, but a man in a rumpled suit, his face contorted with desperation. He wasn't looking at Sarah. He was looking straight at the water, which seemed to swallow the light. As Lily watched, he slowly turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were exactly hers, but they were filled with a frantic, paralyzing fear, the fear of a man who knows he has to choose between two loves and chooses the wrong one. The dream wasn't about love, but about abandonment. It was the raw, primal memory of her father choosing his career over her, his life in the light over his life in the shadows. She woke up with a gasp, the scent of damp earth and river water still sharp in her nose, and the image of his fearful eyes burned into her mind. Access to the subconscious had indeed shown her the truth. James wasn't just a liar. He was a coward who had traded his heart for a congregation. The dream was more than just a dream. It was a revelation, showing her the depth of the spiritual poverty that lay beneath the pastor's expensive suit. The Sunday after the dreadful meeting and the revelatory dream, Reverend James chose his text from the book of Job, focusing on the terrible weight of hidden sins and the purifying fire of confession. He stood tall in the pulpit, his posture rigid, and his gaze seemed to sweep over the congregation, only to stop, sharp and deliberate, right on Lily, sitting in the third pew. His voice was more fervent than usual, a little too loud, a little too strained, ringing with a desperate conviction that was clearly meant for an audience of one. "Friends," he boomed, "we all carry secrets, tucked away in the deepest recesses of our hearts, like stones in our shoes. We try to walk right, we try to appear holy, but that hidden stone, that sin we won't confess, it cripples our stride. It is the serpent in the garden of our soul, poisoning the well of our grace. I tell you, there is no rest, no true peace, until the sin is laid bare before God and man. Only then can the Lord's great mercy finally wash us clean." Lily felt a cold chill run down her spine. This wasn't a sermon. It was a threat and a challenge, wrapped up in the language of salvation. He was warning her, telling her that if she exposed him, he would claim repentance, claim he had suffered for decades, and twist the narrative to make her the one bringing discord to the flock. The sheer audacity of the man, to preach repentance while actively living the lie, fueled Lily's simmering anger into a burning fire. She met his gaze, holding it steady, letting her own eyes, his eyes, reflect the hard, cold truth back at him. She was silently telling him, "I see your stone, Reverend, and I'm ready to turn it over." The service became a silent, internal battle, a war of wills fought right under the towering cross, where the pastor stood on one side, wrapped in his authority, and Lily sat on the other, armed with the undeniable 30-year-old truth. The very next morning, the fragile peace of Harmony Creek was shattered, not by a revelation, but by a siren. Martha, the pastor's delicate wife, had collapsed during the weekly Bible study and was rushed to the county hospital. The news spread through the town like wildfire, and the general consensus was that the stress of life, coupled with her gentle nature, had finally taken its toll. Reverend James was seen leaving the church, his face a mask of worry, and he canceled all his appointments. When Lily heard the news, a terrible, crushing guilt settled over her heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that her silent, subtle pressure, the phone call, the loaded questions in his office, and the defiant stare during the sermon, had been the final, fatal straw that broke Martha's already strained spirit. Martha was the innocent in this whole rotten affair, the true victim who had dedicated her life to the man who had loved another. Lily realized her righteous quest for the truth had real, devastating consequences, and the thought of Martha dying, or being permanently broken, because of a 30-year-old secret felt unbearable. The need to expose James was still strong, but the sudden, immediate need to protect Martha was stronger. Lily knew she had pushed James to the brink, and the burden of his secret, which she had so recently shared, was clearly too heavy for his wife to bear. The stakes had been raised higher than mere reputation. Now it was a matter of life and death, and Lily had to find a way to stop the cascading damage before it took the most innocent person in the whole sorry tale. Driven by a complex mix of guilt and a strange compassion, Lily went to visit Martha in the hospital, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind Miss Edna had said Sarah used to be. The hospital room was quiet, smelling of antiseptic and sadness, and Martha looked small and frail against the stark white sheets. Reverend James was not there. He was reportedly meeting with the elders to discuss the current crisis. Lily sat down by the bed, her voice soft, and they spoke about George, about the community, and about the surprising heat of the late autumn. As Lily was preparing to leave, Martha reached out a weak hand and gently touched Lily's arm, her eyes clear and strangely knowing. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have George's goodness in you, but you have your mother's fire too." She was a beautiful girl, Sarah. Always singing, always had that spark. Lily's heart pounded against her ribs. This was dangerous territory, the thin ice over a deep, dark pond. Then Martha looked past Lily, toward the window, and gave a small, weary sigh. "We all think we know the people we love, child. We build a life on what we see, but the heart holds secrets even from the most faithful partner. I have always known that James and Sarah shared something. It was quiet, Lily. It was quiet as a field mouse, but it was always there, like a faint smell of perfume I could never quite wash away." Lily was stunned. This wasn't an innocent woman. This was a woman who had lived with a quiet, certain suspicion for decades, choosing silence and grace over confrontation. Martha's words echoed in Lily's mind. "I have always known that James and Sarah shared something." The revelation hit Lily with the force of a sudden summer storm. Martha wasn't oblivious. She was simply a woman of deep faith and quiet endurance who had made a conscious choice to live with the known infidelity in order to protect her husband's career and the stability of her world. Her fragility wasn't from ignorance. It was from the sheer, daily effort of pretending that the truth wasn't standing right next to her husband in the form of his first love. This realization completely changed the dynamics of the conflict. It wasn't about saving Martha from a truth she didn't know. It was about respecting her choice to live with the truth she suspected. If Lily exposed James, she wouldn't be shattering Martha's delusion. She would be publicly humiliating a woman who had already chosen to forgive her husband's sin in private and had built her entire identity around his respected position. The guilt that had been a dull ache now sharpened into a knife point of moral dilemma. Lily had set out to honor George's truth and expose James's hypocrisy. But now she was forced to decide whether the public justice she craved was worth the complete destruction of a silent, suffering woman who had already paid the price in 30 years of private heartache. The town of Harmony Creek had forced the original lie, and now it was forcing Lily to continue the silence, all for the sake of the church's reputation. The final meeting had to happen away from the watchful eyes of Harmony Creek, so Lily suggested they meet in the next county over, at a small diner by the highway, a neutral ground, far from the sacred ground James held so dear. When he arrived, James looked older, burdened, and frankly scared. The starched collar seemed to be choking him, and the smooth demeanor was entirely gone. Lily didn't offer niceties. She placed the 2 letters and the copy of her birth certificate right in the middle of the diner table, nestled among the sugar packets and salt shakers. "Reverend," Lily said, her voice low and steady. "Martha knows. Not the documents, perhaps, but she knows. And she is in the hospital because of the pressure of your lie, and my questions. It has to stop now. No more talk of complicated history or youthful folly. I have the proof, James. Now I want the truth, all of it. Tell me why you chose the cloth over your own child." James stared at the papers, his face crumbling like old plaster, and the confession finally came. Not in a boom of pulpit rhetoric, but in a defeated, broken whisper. He was finally just James, the frightened young man from the creek. She was my whole world, Lily. Your mother. But the elders, my father, they demanded a stable path, a proper wife, the perfect life to fit the calling. They said a preacher cannot rise with a scandalous past, or a child born out of wedlock. I was weak, Lily. I chose ambition and fear over love. George was my friend. He loved Sarah so much he offered to give you his name, to save us all. It was a deal made in desperation, and I accepted it, thinking I could still be your spiritual father, if not your real one. Every Sunday, watching you, knowing you were mine. It has been my own private hell, a burning that never stops. He covered his face with his hands, and Lily finally saw the man George had protected. A man broken not by sin, but by the crippling pressure of the Southern expectation. James's raw confession, stripped of his preacher's formality, finally gave Lily the peace that knowledge brings. She knew the truth, and she had seen her father, the real one, finally pay the price in front of her. But the confession didn't solve the problem. It only deepened the moral quandary. The choice was stark. She could use the evidence to tear down the man who had abandoned her, exposing him to the elders and the entire town, which would certainly mean his ruin, the collapse of the church, and the final, crushing public humiliation of Martha. Or, she could choose the path George had taken, the path of quiet sacrifice, honoring his memory by protecting the fragile stability he had worked so hard to maintain. She had sought justice, but perhaps George's love was the real justice. She struggled with the weight of the decision, feeling the eyes of George and James and Martha all weighing on her. She had the power to burn the whole thing down, to set fire to the hypocrisy of Harmony Creek. But she knew that fire would consume the innocent just as surely as the guilty. It wasn't just about James anymore. It was about the kind of person Lily wanted to be, the child of the coward who chose ambition, or the daughter, in spirit, of the selfless man who chose love. This internal battle was fiercer than any sermon, any confrontation, and she knew the answer she found here, in this quiet diner, would define the rest of her life in Harmony Creek. The day came for the annual church business meeting, where the congregation gathered to discuss the finances and the upcoming fall fundraiser, and Lily felt like she was walking toward a firing squad. The letters were tucked deep into her purse, resting right against her thigh, burning a hole through the fabric. Reverend James sat at the head of the long table, looking subdued, his eyes darting toward Lily every few minutes. Lily had agreed to speak about the fundraiser, using the platform she had earned as George's daughter to make her final, public choice. The room was full of all the familiar faces. Miss Edna, who watched everything with unnerving intensity. The town mayor, the elders, who held James's fate in their stern hands, and the choir director, who had once been Sarah's rival in the youth group. Lily stood up when her name was called, and her heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep, steadying breath, and looked out over the faces that had loved George, celebrated James, and quietly judged Sarah for 30 years. She could feel the power in her purse, the power to erase James's career and shatter the peace of the town. All she had to do was reach into that bag, pull out the papers, and read the simple, devastating truth to the room. But as she started to speak, a deep sense of responsibility settled over her, the weight of George's silent love finally guiding her tongue and steadying her spirit. Lily began to speak, not about the fundraiser, but about legacy and sacrifice, choosing her words with the careful, deliberate cadence of a seasoned Southern storyteller. My daddy George, bless his heart, he taught me a lot about true service, she said, her voice gaining strength. He taught me that the greatest acts of love aren't always seen or celebrated. Sometimes, the true measure of a man is not the applause he receives, but the quiet, unseen burden he chooses to carry year after year, for the sake of those he loves. She paused and looked directly at Reverend James, who was watching her with a terrified, pale expression. She didn't accuse him. She didn't expose him. Instead, she chose to immortalize George. George, she continued, her voice thick with genuine emotion. He knew the value of peace, the sacredness of a safe home, and he spent his life protecting that peace. That, friends, is the only inheritance I truly need. She then transitioned smoothly into the fundraiser details, her voice calm and focused, never once reaching for the purse. When she finished, the room applauded, believing they were celebrating George's goodness. James looked at her, his eyes full of the gratitude and shame of a man who had just been pardoned by his own victim. Lily had made her choice. She chose George's way, quiet love over public shame, and the long-term, painful healing of her own soul over the fleeting satisfaction of revenge. The truth remained her secret, transforming from a weapon of destruction into a quiet testament to the man who had saved her family. Life in Harmony Creek didn't return to the way it was, because Lily's own world had fundamentally changed, though no one else knew the reason. She had made peace with George's memory, understanding now that his decision to love and protect her was the strongest, truest form of fatherhood. Reverend James continued to preach, but his sermons lost their fire. They became quieter, more focused on grace and forgiveness, and less on rigid judgment. He was a man humbled, haunted, and forever bound to Lily by a shared, silent knowledge. He looked at her differently now, with a deep, wordless respect for her choice to spare him and Martha. Martha, who recovered and returned to her spot in the front pew, greeted Lily with an almost maternal tenderness, a tenderness that suggested she understood the gravity of the choice Lily had made. Lily saw her mother, Sarah, too, with new eyes, no longer as a nervous woman living a lie, but as a young woman who loved fiercely and survived a painful heartbreak with the help of a noble man. The truth, like kudzu, was still there, wrapping itself around the heart of the community, but Lily learned to live with it, accepting that some secrets are too deeply rooted to be pulled up without killing the whole garden. She kept the letters, not as evidence of a crime, but as a testament to the complex, messy, and ultimately beautiful ways people choose to love and forgive. Lily, the pastor's secret child, had found her real identity not in blood, but in the enduring, quiet kindness of George, the man who proved that a daddy is not just a title, but a choice made every single day, right down to the creek and back again. She finally understood that some stories are best told in a whisper, and that in the South, the greatest truth is often found not in what is shouted, but in what is quietly endured.